Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I am here with the co-founder of Catalyst Sale, Mike Simmons. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Jody.
Mike, I'm so excited about today's guest. We've got Oz Alashe, and I've got to tell you, he might have the best accent of anybody we've had on the show so far.
Way to break the lead of the story. I thought we were going to keep that secret.
Oh, well, I got too excited. I couldn't, but I'll turn it over to you now so I don't spoil anything else. Tell us about Oz.
So I was fortunate enough to meet Oz recently related to his business. Oz is the CEO of CybSafe. They are a company that is focused on the human aspect of cybersecurity. And I've become really interested in cybersecurity primarily because I'm trying to figure out the difference between the stuff that I should wear a tinfoil hat as a result of and those things that are actual reality out there. I know most of us plug our phones in at the airport. And when we plug our phones into the airport, we plug into this USB port instead of a direct power source. And rarely do we think about what the potential impact of doing so is. We also do it in cars. So I figured the audience would really enjoy a discussion with someone who's an expert in this space. And Oz, thanks for being able to join us.
Hi, Mike. No, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So there you go. Jody has demonstrated that we weren't a global podcast until we had someone from the UK on. And so Oz, you get the distinction of having the best accent that we've had so far, which is probably going to offend some of the folks we had from Austin and Nashville.
I'm flattered. I'm flattered. Although I must say that having seen some of the great podcasts you've gone before, it's just great to be in such good company.
Awesome. So one of the things that has gotten me interested in cybersecurity is GDPR, and GDPR more from the perspective of I don't want to make a mistake when we start communicating out to potential prospects. Many sales reps and many professionals out there will communicate in mass. They won't necessarily do one-to-one communication. They may look to broadcast communication or one-to-many communication. And you see some of the components of GDPR, which talk about privacy of data and personal privacy and things that you do with the information. Many of the people who listen to the podcast have work in organizations where those organizations hold on to a significant amount of customer data. So I thought, why not have someone who is intimately aware of GDPR join us and talk a bit about that on the front end of the discussion. So Oz, what is GDPR?
Well, Mike, it's a good question. Lots of businesses around the globe actually are asking themselves, what is GDPR, which stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a piece of EU legislation, so European Union legislation, but it actually affects businesses all around the world because actually what it's looking to do is standardize data and data laws across the European Union countries, specifically about how they should be demanding and protecting the data protection rights around their data subjects. And of course, as you've already suggested, businesses all around the globe, including in the US, will be having access to, relying quite heavily on the data of the European data subjects. And if you're one of those businesses, if you are engaging with Europeans, if you have European customers and clients, then you'll be caught by it.
And are you seeing instances around the globe where other geographic regions, even specific countries, are starting to adopt stricter regulations following the lead of those being put in place related to GDPR?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, what we're seeing is what many would describe as just a convergence of expectation. The reality is that all of us as individuals, we are increasingly aware of the threats that we face from cyber attack, but actually the threats that we face because of our reliance. In many ways, some people would describe over-reliance, but actually I think it's a very good thing on technology, on increased digitization, on increased connectivity, our businesses, the way in which we live our lives. And so actually, it's only natural, therefore, that governments would start to say to businesses, well, that's fine. You can conduct your business as you need to. But if you're going to do so and you're going to rely so heavily on personal data, we need to know that you're looking after it properly. And that's really what GDPR is really shaped at. And we're seeing that around the globe in lots of different forms. Different nations, so the European bloc is one bloc, But actually, even that, within that, different nations will slightly interpret things differently. Actually, China's just published its consultation piece on its new data legislation. Actually, the US has been doing so for some time and, of course, has had pretty stringent and clear data legislation for many years. And increasingly, these different data legislation regimes are converging in terms of their expectation.
I think when I think of it from a sales perspective, I would expect, especially if I'm working with a product, a SaaS-based product that has user data contained within. And I think of what I've done in the edtech space with companies like SmartForce and Skillsoft and Safari Books Online and just some of the others. I mean, you think of the LMS products that are out there, there's a large amount of data that is housed inside those systems. So I would expect that the sales professionals out there who are selling these products, maybe it might even be a CRM, like a Salesforce or a HubSpot, they are likely going to get questions from their customer base about how they're meeting these requirements. And if they're not getting direct questions from their customer base, they're likely going to see things incorporated in contract language that require a certain level of expertise or compliance related to these items. Is that a fair assumption?
It's absolutely a fair assumption. And we're seeing it manifest itself in the ways that you describe, and actually at real pace as well. So it is not uncommon now, and indeed, actually, we're a business, as you mentioned, CybSafe, a cybersecurity tech business. So we obviously take this quite seriously, wanting to practice what we preach. But of course, we also fundamentally believe it's the right thing. So we ensure that not only are we taking the best possible care with the data that we have entrusted to us, and that idea of entrusting data or being a custodian of data, I think, is an important one we should come back to. But we also make sure that anybody we deal with can demonstrate that they are doing the same thing. And by that, I mean third-party suppliers that we rely on. And you're absolutely right. We have resent out our contract awards in order to, with a change in terms and asking people to demonstrate or to sign that they have done. And we're increasingly seeing that push down, not just to us, but actually we're seeing it to our customers and to other people who are also in supply chains of larger organizations, but all demanding that everybody's taking this more seriously. And it's spanning across the globe, as I mentioned. This is not a solely GDPR specific issue. Actually, this is a data legislation requirement that many countries are seeing flow through their economies for good reason as well.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about CybSafe and why did you start the company? What was the reason behind starting CybSafe and what's your mission?
Well, again, as we've touched on right at the very beginning, cybersecurity is a real issue today. And it's an issue in many ways for good reason, because as a society or a series of societies, and indeed as a global community, we are more reliant on technology than we've ever been. It's enabling us to do some really quite extraordinary things as a group of human beings. And of course, for every negative thing that you hear about technology, there are far more positive things that we are all beneficiaries of. And indeed, some really great, exciting things that are going to happen in the future. We firmly believe that opportunity, which is really what it is something we should all lean into. And indeed, we want to see happen more. But one of the things that is really clear, and I have a public service background, which I can maybe explain a little bit more in a minute. But one of the things that's really clear is that actually we're not always as secure when interacting with technology as we should be. And cybersecurity, that's really the space that cybersecurity occupies, which is the ability to secure networks, systems, and data. And the reality is that the majority of people aren't as secure in their behavior as they should be. And when you look at the cybersecurity challenges we all face as businesses, they fall really in one of three areas: people, process, or technology. When I left the military after a short 17-year service stint, actually quite a lot of my time while serving was focused on developing information into intelligence in order for us to affect people who really shouldn't have been doing what they were doing, and therefore trying to have some sort of positive national security effect. But the principle is still the same on this side of the fence. Actually, there are businesses who are trying to get about their business, but are struggling to do so because they're not secure. They're really focused on the technology and the process. But when it comes to people, they're paying lip service to it. They are maybe conducting some form of tick box awareness training. CybSafe is a response to that particular challenge. Most organizations actually don't want to do training for the sake of it. They want to change behavior positively, to know that the effort they're putting into awareness activity is working. And that's what we look to do. We look to measure three things: what people know, how people think, and how people behave, and demonstrate to an organization that it's becoming less vulnerable over time. But more importantly, help individuals, people like you and I, behave better online so we can be more secure in our personal lives and in our private lives. And so our software platform does just that.
So when you get into the behavior piece, how do you address that? Like, how does that come into play?
So measuring behavior and indeed changes in behavior is really quite challenging. There is no shortage, actually, decades worth of really good academic research into the psychology behind why we do what we do online, and indeed the behavioral science theories and models associated with those theories about how one might measure it, or certainly one might regard it. And we rely really heavily on that academic theory. It's a foundation for us because the reality is we know that much of the activity that we're doing, so, as you mentioned, the EdTech community and e-learning is not new in any way, shape or form, but there's some really, really positive and progressive approaches that are all based on behavior change theory. So we take those theories and we apply it to accredited content. The accreditation of content is really important. It's not for us all to make up what we should know. There are some really quite capable international bodies and national bodies, for that matter as well, that have determined what the fundamentals of cybersecurity are and what everybody should know. And we make sure people have that information, which is what we really push through our platform.
I had an interesting conversation at an event that I was at earlier, the TLDC 18 conference, which happened in January. And in one of the discussions that we had around cybersecurity, the piece around social engineering came into play, and how those who are interested in doing wrong are actually investing in social engineering, the psychology of human behavior and behavioral analytics. Can you talk to why that's the case and why we should be aware that this is really, one of the comments was this is a chess game. They make a couple of moves, we make a couple of moves. They make a couple of moves, and it goes on, which speaks to this ongoing need for reinforcement, but also the importance of behavior change. Can you talk to how that is playing into cybersecurity in general these days?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, social engineering, which for those, I guess, listeners who may not know, is the art of manipulating people so that we give up information that is either confidential or sensitive, or maybe just information that we would rather you wouldn't have done knowingly or willingly. Really, that's what social engineering is in a nutshell. It's actually one of the cornerstones of cybercrime. Most cyber attacks start or have a person involved, an unwitting, or indeed most people, when they think of cybercrime, they think of hackers, as people rather lazily sometimes call them, but cyber criminals really accessing systems and stealing information or stealing money, but they miss the fact that they've got to have access to the system in the first place, and they use a person who doesn't realize. And that's social engineering. They might do that in order to get information, in order to present a scenario that is believable, in order to get you to give them information you shouldn't do, or they might steal it from you, but they need to work out a way of getting near it in the first place, or they might work it out by looking at your social media accounts and work their way around that way. All sorts of ways that ultimately people can use social engineering to get you to give up information or give access to something you wouldn't otherwise do. And you're right when you say that it's a really important part, or understanding it is a really important part of cybersecurity, because if we accept and understand that criminals are trying to socially engineer us in lots of different ways, then we will be wiser to some of their ruses, some of their attempts, and actually consider other ways in which we might protect ourselves.
So what comes to mind for me is, and I've mentioned it before about plugging a phone into a USB port at an airport, or plugging a phone into a USB port in a rental car. These are all technical kind of things. They're behavior on the human side, and that I'm doing something that I probably shouldn't do. What are some of the other behavioral things that folks should be aware of that they may not be aware of when it comes to areas where they're putting either themselves or their families at risk when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, I mean, it's probably best to start with social engineering, because some of these things are really quite common practice. And some of them will sound really obvious to many of your listeners, but not necessarily to all. So I suspect most people will be aware that one of the most common forms of cyber attack is the phishing email that is pretending to be from somebody or some organization that is not true. It's not them. And actually, the aim of that email is to get you to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do if you knew that it really wasn't who they were pretending to be. Maybe click on a link or respond with some information. So that's a really common way. Again, different to the, I guess, cast iron technical scenario you've given, where you might plug your device into a system that you don't know, you don't understand, and therefore you can't guarantee as a safe system, and you therefore don't know what's going to happen to your device. In this particular case, you're expecting to get emails. That's what your inbox is for. But you're receiving an email maybe from a party that you trust, but it's not true. So that's one example of the kind of, I guess, quite common cybersecurity scenario we see. Others are really what you refer to many people refer to rather lovingly as, rather than phishing, smishing. So SMS text messages, really aimed at doing exactly the same thing. We're all really reliant on our smart devices nowadays. Receiving messages on those sometimes feel more legit than dodgy messages from Nigerian princes that you receive by an email, maybe slightly less threatening to receive a text message. But actually, the reality is that an SMS message might be also malicious and might be from a wrong area. So those are a couple of examples just there, but there are many others.
So one of the things that I've seen in the market is there are a number of companies that'll do phishing tests. And actually, we talked about this at the event this week and there I go dating the podcast as I like to do, but where there was a member, and this was a learning community primarily, but there was a member of this community that I was talking with, and they said that they've fallen for the same phishing attack 3 times in a row. And the remediation is to put the person through the same awareness training. And their feedback was, I've gone through the awareness training over and over again. It just isn't working. And there's also this sense of being put in detention where they were targeted by the company and they're being isolated as not being smart. In another instance, one of the people who's responsible for sending these out, people don't make eye contact with him in the hallways anymore because they know it's happening. So how do you do these tests in a way this is going to get back to the human aspect of it. How do you do these tests in a way that you're treating people with dignity and respect and working toward behavior change? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, but Mike, before I do, just tell me, is this one of those third-party confessions where that person is you and you just don't want anybody to know? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hey, no, you raise a really serious point. Because here's the truth of it. We have all made mistakes, all of us. And like I said, actually, anybody who suggests that they know everything there is to know about cybersecurity and never get anything wrong, I would suggest is either exaggerating or just downright telling porcupines. The truth of the matter is that criminals are pretty smart and they go out of their way. This is a business, remember, and there's some really quite motivated individuals sat behind those terminals creating those phishing emails. So there are going to be people who make mistakes. But the process and the whole point of running simulated phishing campaigns and training exercises and remediating any vulnerabilities or taking remediative action when you find their vulnerabilities should be positive. And if it's not, and I would suggest that if people are fearful, if people are not making progress, if you're doing the same thing over and over again and it's not working, then actually you could question whether or not we are, and in that particular case, that particular organization is using its resources in the best possible way. So we do see and come across a number of organizations who run phishing simulated campaigns, actually in order to see whether people will fail them, rather than helping people understand what they should or shouldn't be doing and then assessing whether or not they are making any progress. We also see what you suggested, which is people conducting training on the back of failing phishing, but actually not doing very much training beforehand. And therefore, you've kind of linked training with failure. And psychologically, that's never a great thing to do and not a way to elicit a positive response. And as I've said, as an organization, we don't just believe in conducting cyber security activity for the sake of it. Actually, if it's not working, you need to do something different. But if it's not working, there are many frameworks, and actually the psychology and the behavioral science theory behind changing behavior goes some way to describe some of the things that should be done and how it can be done positively. And everything you've described there would suggest to me that maybe those things haven't been taken into account. We try to do that at CybSafe. So
let's talk about things that the audience can do just to be aware of it. Like for me, when I think of where our risk is, I can put a number of controls in place related to our network, and I can put controls in place relative to educating the kids on not connecting to unsecure Wi-Fi and being careful about clicking on links that are sent from folks. There are times where we get tracking email or tracking notifications from UPS, and it might be that Jen, my wife, orders something. I didn't realize that she ordered it. I click on the link, and I don't necessarily know that was actually sent from UPS. And I know that's a common attack that's out there. But what are some of the things that we can do as individuals when we're thinking about our own personal engagement, the things that we coach our family on? What are some things that we can do?
Well, I guess one of the first things that we can all do, and it sounds unpleasant to say, but actually, when you consider why I'm saying it is really quite positive, is to stop being so trusting. Because the reality is we're hardwired to want to trust, to want to believe in goodness in most people. Most of us are that way inclined. But we currently live, and indeed I don't think this is going to change anytime soon, in a society where the majority of people mean you very, very well. They certainly don't mean you any harm. But there are some people who will take advantage of your devices to feather their own nest and certainly damage yours. So to not be so trusting as a disposition would be really quite helpful, because then it would encourage you to do a number of things. It would encourage you, when you receive communications from anybody, actually individuals or organizations, to go the extra mile, maybe to assess whether they are who they say they are. And one of the ways you can go the extra mile, for example, in the case of being sent an email link, would be to hover on the link to see whether actually what shows up when you hover over a link is actually what is being presented to you on the page. Generally, what shows up is actually where that link is going to take you to. And you might find, therefore, that something that says it's going to take you to the CNN website is taking you somewhere that's spelt slightly incorrectly. Which leads me on to the next thing you can do. Have a look at the spelling of, and be careful about checking the spelling of the site's URLs, the links that you're going to. One of the really quite a common attack vectors being used when trying to divert unwitting people to malicious sites is to create sites that look like, in terms of spelling, something very real, but actually are spelled ever so slightly incorrectly. At a glance, you wouldn't necessarily notice it, but actually, if you looked at it properly, you would do. So that's another thing that one can do. The other is actually just to check. Actually, if you receive something out of the blue from somebody you weren't expecting, then give them a call. Did you mean to send me that email? I've just received something that's the spelling's a bit off from your inbox. Has your inbox been hacked and has somebody taken control? These things are really common practices. And again, it all comes back to that point about trust. And as organizations, we need to expect people to ask us those questions as well. If you're sending out poorly spelt with dodgy grammar emails, then don't be surprised if people stick it straight in their spam box, because people are going to take that stuff more seriously nowadays.
And I think that trust piece is something that's come up, and you're seeing more and more of. I mean, once you've violated that trust, you have an attack like Target had, or you have an attack like Equifax had, and those are a couple of the larger ones, and there are some other ones that may be a bit lesser known, but it can have a significant impact on your reputation in the marketplace. And with that loss of reputation, then there's this lack of trust, and people are getting concerned about sharing their data with you as an organization.
Absolutely right. You've kind of touched on it. We started by talking about GDPR, and I mentioned custodianship, the idea of being a custodian of somebody's data. Ultimately, as organizations, and many of your listeners, whether they are working in sales teams, in which, of course, they will know all about trust, and the fact that the reality is that the trust relationship that they have and the currency that they trade on will be basically about whether or not, yes, of course, the customer they're speaking to has a problem. And yes, of course, whether what they're offering to solve that problem can do what it says on the tin. But ultimately, do they trust them to deliver against that, you as an individual or you as an organization? The same is really true of our data. We're all gravitating towards organizations that will look after our data and look after our finances better. If you violate that, if you are demonstrated to be an organization that doesn't take that responsibility seriously, then don't be surprised when people start to vote with their feet and go and find other organizations to trade with, to partner with, to buy from. And so, yes, it does all boil down to trust, actually. And unsurprisingly, that's both our customers, that's maybe our employees or staff or colleagues as well, because the reality is that who wants to work in an organization that the HR department is going to be hacked and all of my personal data is going to find itself on the dark web? I don't particularly want to do that either. So it's so these things are really important, and it's about trust, yes.
Oz, this has been great information, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us. The thing that comes to mind next is where do we go from here? And I think of devices that I've got in the house. I took our Amazon Echo, moved it out of the kitchen and moved it into my office, and I now have it constantly on mute, so that the only thing I do with it is turn it on when I want to listen to music or I want a specific update. I did that because we were talking about things and they all of a sudden started showing up in our search results, or we see ads for it. So when we add in these new technologies like Internet of Things and connected devices and the benefits associated with that, how does that increase our potential risk, and what should we do about it? And is it something we really should worry about? Any guidance or recommendations or thoughts around that?
Yes, well, I think that the future, which is really what you're asking, where are we going as a society? Where are we going as individuals? The reality is we're going to get more connected, and the Internet of Things, the Internet of Everything, is going to become even more pervasive in many ways than it is right now. And as you have suggested, and indeed as I firmly believe, there are huge benefits in this. But there are challenges along with that. And many of those challenges are actually challenges that will need to be dealt with at national level. Everything from legislation, from regulation, from maybe even the consideration of some of the ethics behind some of the things that we expect manufacturers to be doing in order to encourage us to use their products. There's quite a school and body of thought about the psychology behind why we get so excited by technology in the way that we do, and how ethical some of that is. So we're going to see more of that. From the security side, there will be increased risk, because as more and more of our nations become connected and come online, and actually as more of the globe becomes connected online, the opportunity for criminals increases over time. The good side, and the good thing about that development, is that actually we're getting smarter about the way we challenge and counter these threats. We are using technology to our advantage to help protect us. And of course, some developments in technology, which of course are dual-sided, double-edged in many ways. So thinking of technology like artificial intelligence, cognitive computing capability, which, for example, in CybSafe, we use cognitive computing, deeper learning, in order for the platform to evolve and learn, so that actually in terms of delivering awareness training, we're delivering awareness training that is relevant, contextualized, and actually tailored to the individual on the basis of how you like to take information on. That's a really clever use of technology in order to help us be more secure, so we can make great use of technology. And we're going to see more and more of that. And actually, you see that across the security field in general. So I think this is a really exciting times. I think there are challenging times. And whether that's looking at the geopolitical states, whether that's looking at some of the challenges that are taking place, and the elections in various countries around the world, lots and lots to suggest that those things have been tampered with, or certainly have been influenced by cyber attacks. We're not going to see any less of that. We're just going to see more of that. And so we're going to all get much smarter about how we look after ourselves in the digital space.
So the thing that I hope happens in this space is that we don't look at it in the same way we've looked at things like compliance training from an anti-harassment perspective, where the training happens at one point in time, and then you've got to be recertified 2 years later, in the case of California with AB 1825, that this becomes a continuous process. Because if you're not looking at this as a behavioral item, as something that you need to continue to stay on top of over time, as something that is integrated into your culture, then all you're doing is increasing your long-term risk inside an organization. You're not addressing the way that the criminals or the people who want to get at your data are addressing it, which is they are constantly changing. Oz mentioned it earlier. He talked about this. This is a business to them. There are a lot of ideas behind social engineering, and not from the standpoint of getting information from folks. So I think about it more from the targeting that happens, that align with what we do from a sales perspective. We identify people who influence others inside an organization as a way to get access into those organizations. So these criminals are designing their approach to the market similar to the way that I would recommend people design their approach to sales inside organizations. And I'm not saying be a criminal, but you can see some alignment there. Oz, anything else to add?
No, I think that in terms of the alignment and the approach, I would 100% agree. It is very much mapping the territory in order to identify the best way in. In terms of, I guess, people ticking a box, compliance training rather than reducing risk, really reducing risk. We've seen, and of course, given what we do, we see this very regularly. businesses switching over to us because I think, well, I'm going to put the same amount of effort in anyway. So if I've got to tick a box, I'm going to run some compliance training. I might as well do something that's effective and I can see the demonstration of that effect. I can see and indeed get an indication of a return on that investment. And actually I can demonstrate to the regulator in the event that something goes wrong, or maybe I have a breach, or indeed actually something happens and I'm questioned, I can demonstrate to the regulator I've done all I could have done to reduce the chance of having a breach. And we're seeing enlightened businesses and organizations, either because unfortunately things haven't gone well in the past and they know they've got to do better, or because they've seen other people have that issue, or because they just are having conversations like this, like we're having now, and they just wake up to the fact that, gosh, it's in my interest to reduce this risk. Because like I said, the fines aren't the issue. For most organizations, if you get fined, so it can be painful, but actually the loss of reputation and the damage to your business and the loss of trust, that's where the issue is really going to be painful. And so yes, why tick a box when you can have effect? When it comes to awareness training, there's some really great products out there. CybSafe is one, but there are some others who are doing some really interesting stuff. Go for something that is much more effective than tick box training.
One of the things that really stuck to me, you guys have talked about details of so much, but just the idea, Oz, that you said, don't be as trusting. I think that's the one thing we can all take away from this is there are people out there that only have to be right once. Just don't be so trusting. I love that.
Yeah. Hey, well, JD, I think that's, it sounds, sometimes a little bit negative, but it's not a negative thing. It's actually a positive thing because don't be so trusting. Don't expect everybody who emails you to mean you well, because some of them don't exist. Don't expect every company that you work with to be taking this as seriously as you do. That big contract that you're going for, that big proposal that you're writing, when they turn to you and ask you to be sure that you're looking after their data, that includes those other companies that you rely on for third-party support. They need to take it seriously as well. You might need to ask them. Don't trust, just ask. Great.
Oz, where can we find out more about you and what you're up to?
Well, anybody who's interested in hearing more about how we help address the human component in cybersecurity can visit our website, www.cybsafe, that's CYBSAFE, cybsafe.com. And we're based in London, but we help companies all around the world. And we're really excited. We've got some amazing partners who are working really quite closely with organizations and ensuring that you have access to the software. Really happy to tell you more. Visit us. We will will absolutely point you in the right direction. And we have conversations like this all over the place. And we're really excited to do so. It's a step change in approach when it comes to this aspect of cybersecurity.
Well, thank you so much, Oz. This has been great to have you on. And as always, thank you, Mike Simmons. And if you want to find out more about Catalyst Sale or listen to past episodes of the show, you can do so at catalystsale.com. Until next week, thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.